Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to listen to an overview of language building blocks. It was just released from Teachers College Press, and I would very much want to hear your feedback. It can be ordered from the Teachers College Press website or from Amazon, and there will be a site up and running very soon, languagebuildingblocks.com. It will have additional activities and further readings for each chapter. So let's begin with a quick overview of the book. Here is basically a kind of reflection question for teachers, parents, grandparents, anyone with little kids. To me, language is the heart of early childhood education. In fact, research shows that in the early years, we really need to develop language skills. And I just wanted to quickly show you what some benefits might be of looking at other language systems, just the writing systems. For example, and most of you can recognize these, you can see the resemblance between the Arabic numbers, which actually came from India, and the Arab world introduced them to the Western world. And they're very similar to the way we write the numbers 0 to 9. This is how we write Hindi, and interestingly, the second letter is read first, sort of giving us a sense of the conceptual patterns of children from language backgrounds that are not similar to English. So in other words, as a teacher, before we dismiss a child as being disorganized because they cannot sequence a story or retell a story in the sequence that we expect, we may want to think about how do they do it in their language. So here's an overview. I would like to start with a quote from Dr. King. Dr. King said, "Some people aren't going to like the way you talk." And there is a chapter in this book on how important it is to be aware of dialects and other languages in terms of people's identities, because to me language is literally your walking and talking DNA. It gives you a sense of where you came from, where your ancestors came from, and who you interacted with, migration, climate change. Pretty much language is the litmus test. So the first chapter just gives you an overview of how important the science of language is, namely linguistics, and that's what we call language ABC. So we break it apart in terms of phonemes, the smallest sounds of every language, and so the roughly 6,000 or so languages in the world can all be reduced to a single chart that we call the International Phonetic Alphabet that we'll see momentarily, that has only 50-some sounds. So we have more in common than we think, or that we might think. And then we also have morphemes, which many teachers miss, which is that level between sounds and words. So for instance, went is go plus past tense. And it's very important for us as teachers to get children to think about meaning early on, because the more words they understand, the more they'll be able to talk about, and the more they'll be able to recognize in print. So before we can even make them good readers and writers, we need to build their vocabulary. And the secret to building their vocabulary is to get them to understand words. And in order to get them to understand words, we have to obviously make them phonemically aware, make them aware of how sounds are actually captured through letters. And that letters are simply suitcases, and they can carry many sounds. The second chapter makes a case for why we need to move beyond short and long vowels, because as most of us teachers know, we tend to talk about vowels in a very general sense of short versus long, and we'll see some examples of how that may not necessarily help all the children that we need to help. The third chapter gives you an overview of the history of English, and it makes the case that in order to teach reading and writing, we really need to explain to our children where these words came from, because English is the first international language that we know of, and it is truly international in that it has borrowed from many, many languages. So we have words like sugar, which came from India, from shakar. Candy too came from India, from Hindi, from Sanskrit originally, and the world's largest family of languages, namely the Indo-European languages, was represented initially, the mother language is Sanskrit, and even English derives ultimately from Sanskrit. So for example, the word name, nama, came from nama. Mother, father, brother, sister, these relationship words came from Sanskrit, and eventually through Latin and Greek became part of what we know as English. So many words came from also French, for example, all our administration words, and then we got lots of words from Latin, through Spanish, many of them, through French, many of them, But we have a lot of words from different languages. Just to give you an example of a word from an African language, we have many music words that have come, including mojo, and then words like, for example, gumbo, food type words unique to the flora and fauna and the terrain of the countries. Food words are characteristic of many languages, and they've been brought into English. For example, ketchup comes from Asia, and it's now become part of the English vocabulary. And children, when they know the stories behind these words, are more likely to remember them and also to understand their spelling peculiarities. So, for instance, when we tell a child does not sound like cha, but it sounds like sha, as in champagne, chauffeur, they'll immediately know that that's a French word. And we really need to help them understand those exceptions. And that's why I'm proposing an overview of the history of English. And one more word from Africa that would be of interest to some students is okay, that we got from Africa. And from Arabic we got checkmate, which is basically from sheikh mat. And from Hebrew we got a whole bunch of words. From German we got kindergarten, garden for children. So when teachers know this and make this history interesting to children, I think it's more fun for children to learn about spelling. And the fourth chapter is about language and math, basically making the case that in order to ensure that children understand math, they need to understand that there's a language of math. And for instance, you can teach sound blending or phonemic awareness using language units. So for example, you can combine sounds and use addition and subtraction. We'll see some examples. And we'll also see some examples in this chapter of how certain words or certain synonyms might help certain children from different language backgrounds understand math concepts faster. For example, point versus dot. For some children, the point of intersection may be hard to identify if they do not understand the word point, but they may already be familiar with the word dot. For those children, you might actually use the word dot to transition them to point of intersection. For children who have a background in Latin languages like Spanish, which use words like punto, point might be more useful. So it just depends on the language background, and these are some things that we should be aware of. Then we go to the chapter on early language and dialect awareness. This is the chapter that says in order to use drama in the classroom or theater, characters could speak different languages. There are lots of authors who have written bilingual books, and also some bilingual readers that capture the different sounds of Southern English, for instance, right here in the United States, or different regional dialects. And when the characters speak different languages, the children have more fun. They begin to see that we all have unique ways of talking, but we all have correct ways, because there are incorrect ways of talking in certain regions, in certain socioeconomic classes, and there are correct ways. So for instance, Appalachian English, children who speak Appalachian English or who speak an urban dialect, they need to feel at home. And the way to bring out their originality is to make them realize that they have a lot of unique skills to offer in the classroom. And you'd be quite surprised at how much they can tell you in terms of what are some things said in their households. For example, sayings, maxims that are unique to the region, and they can pepper the courses and the classes and make them fun. There's a chapter on food. Basically, children learn very well when we teach them vocabulary in context. What better way to teach vocabulary than through food? In fact, Robert Marzano, who is the specialist, or one of the specialists in vocabulary instruction, says that there are about 60 that children need to learn from age preschool through 12th grade. And if you look at his latest book, of the 60 clusters, more than half have to do with food. So for instance, if children are preparing recipes in their classrooms, they can actually learn very quickly the different basically all the ingredients that they have to get. And then verbs, mixing, blending, cutting, chopping. And then quantity words like 2 cups of this, 2 spoons of that. Colors, they can learn all the sensory words. So they're learning words in context, and they're learning sequencing. First we do this, then we do that, which is basically skills that transfer to science. The science of cooking. Why do we fry versus bake? What is the calorie content? They also learn about foods from different cultures, because we live in a global world. And in fact, this chapter was inspired by my children. When my first child was going to kindergarten, I asked her what she wanted to eat for lunch, and she asked me to pack her favorite food, and she picked a mango achar, which is basically mango pickle, and to my surprise, her food came back. I found out eventually that she was too embarrassed. But there are a lot of kids who come to school with foods that may not look like pizza or the foods that other kids are eating. And it's about time our children were exposed to different foods. And this chapter is a good way to introduce that. Here's an example, for example, in India, and this came from a website, Unforgotten. It's a charity that sends children to school in parts of Asia and Africa. These are children who grow up on garbage dumps and don't have a full family or much family support, and they actually work for a living. But notice how they're sitting on the floor and they're eating out of stainless steel vessels, the Indian English term for plates and cups, and that's because the belief is that stainless steel is not contaminated, it does not have carcinogenics, and it's very healthy for you. And the children eat with their fingers, which some might say is ew, but the idea is to cut the nails short and wash your hands and eat, because that's how you capture the flavor of the food. So even a single picture like this could be a great way to introduce certain vocabulary terms and the science of contamination and a whole bunch of other things. Here is the next chapter. It's on dual language acquisition. Basically, how do children acquire languages? The first language and second language, if they are lucky enough or fortunate enough to learn another language. And it's very interesting to notice that the 6,000 or so languages in the world almost all follow a similar order of acquisition, and that, interestingly, certain sounds are acquired first. For instance, m is acquired before b, and the differences between those have to do with voicing or movement in the vocal cords, and that certain words are acquired before other words, certain clause structures are acquired before others, and so on and so forth. So it's really interesting for us as teachers to know that before we dismiss a child as language delayed. Maybe it's just part of the developmental growth of a child. So that's the reason for that chapter. It gives strategies for success, discusses theories and approaches to language acquisition. And then there's a chapter on language for special needs, which covers the whole autism spectrum as well as other areas of concern. And it gives lots of checklists, and there's an accompanying website that is, it's called the Resource Guide, that's posted on the Columbia University website, and I will refer you to that as well, but it's also in the introduction to languagebuildingblocks.com will have additional checklists and activities. And finally, there's a chapter on language and literacy, basically the influence of technology in early childhood education and how to ensure that you are maximizing technology and making sure that the learning objectives are met, and using technology that really works and does not actually impede learning. And there's also a chapter on power dynamics, which is the final chapter, on how to capture agency of a child. For instance, it's a good way to detect bullying tendencies, domination by one child or an adult over a classroom. It gives you strategies for monitoring who is in control and who has the greatest power both inside and outside the classroom. So these are some this is just a quick overview of the chapters in this book. I also want to emphasize the importance of play, going back to this chapter on language acquisition, because a lot of us are hearing that recess time has been cut at many schools, or many children have to, and that sort of suggests that we're moving away from recess and play. And this book reminds us that play is very important for children, because when children interact with others, especially with their peers, that's when they learn vocabulary, because they meet the three ingredients that are essential for language acquisition, namely input, that they understand, interaction, and then feedback or scaffolding. And if we can ensure those three, then we can be very certain that our children are learning. And the objective essentially throughout the book is to prompt children to discover language, and through this to acquire core content in all the areas that we would like them to be good at, and much more. And the children's observations and their own errors are showcased as evidence of their learning. So, for instance, if a child misuses the ed suffix and says, I drank the milk, we know that they have understood that the ed means past, even though they're using it incorrectly. And these signals can tell us a lot about what stage of language acquisition they're at. And we can also understand through their own self-corrections what their cognitive skills, or metacognitive skills as we call that in linguistics. Here we see, this is part of the technology chapter on how children are Skyping their cousins and doing shared story time using technology. This is just a quick diagram of the centrality of language in early childhood education. It's sort of, language is the center of the wheel of learning. At the center of the wheel of learning is the content we want them to acquire, namely language, arts, math, social studies, physical education, health education, media, music, and other areas that we test them on. Then, of course, all areas have some dimension of listening involved, some speaking, some reading, and or some form of writing. And usually we tend to use or try to use as much technology as possible. At least most teachers, and sometimes the children are doing this on their own at home through technology gadgets and tools that they have available. But all of this has language involved through listening, speaking, the primary skills, reading and writing are secondary skills, basically skills that we're not born with but that we create. And we tend to emphasize these when in fact we should be emphasizing listening and speaking first, and then reading and writing will follow. This is just a quick quote that says that academic language permeates schooling and that all teachers are in fact language teachers. And one teacher shares that knowledge of linguistics has helped her to understand her students' source of confusion and how. And here's just a quick diagram of the pyramid of language. And I just want to end by talking quickly about discourse. This is a level that we tend to miss as teachers. Discourse is the subcultural, culture-unique ways, culture-specific ways of expressing ourselves. For instance, some languages do not have a word for excuse me. Some languages do not have expressions that translate to you're welcome or de nada. In some cultures, you can actually interrupt somebody. You have overlapping turns. And if we are not aware of that as teachers, then we may think that a child is impolite. And knowing a little bit about the discourse structure, the language function, and the sequencing through which, for example, requests or compliments are delivered or issued can help us understand how to proceed with each. And I just want to give you a quick final example of how you can look at the discourse structure of a quick letter written by a 5-year-old. She says, "Dear Tooth Fairy, can I please have 2 bags of candy with any kind of candy? Can I also have 20 candies, please? Thank you for reading this letter. Your friend, Sahara." If you can't get any candy, then you can always get a bunk bed or anything else. And this is a child who is trying to be polite, but actually being very persuasive. And if you think about it, the letter is a request. So the discourse is that of a request, and she is trying to politely sequence it by first asking in the polite, expected way, using the please and the can, before she indirectly says a bunk bed will do just fine. And actually, a bunk bed is really what she wants. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing your feedback.